That sounds
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Popular Music Books in Process. I'm Eric Weisbard, one of the co-organizers. We are a joint project of IASPM US, the Pop Conference, and the Journal of Popular Music Studies, covering different book topics every week, or every 2 weeks, or every month. This next 3 week stretch is busy. April 22nd, jazz musician Wadada Leo Smith will be in conversation with Nina Soon Eidsheim on the forthcoming book In Search of Light, a dialogue about the music and philosophy of Wadada Leo Smith. But today we have two incredibly accomplished people talking Frank Sinatra. Chuck Granata, who writes under the name Charles L. Granata, and Dana Polan. Hoboken to Hollywood, The American Places of Frank Sinatra is their book in progress, and um, due in mid-May for Reaktion Publishers' Reverb series, looking at Sinatra in relationship to place, as all the books in that series contemplate place. I'm going to tell you a little bit about our two presenters and then hand things over to them. Chuck Granata is the author of a bunch of books, the very widely heralded Sessions with Sinatra, Frank Sinatra and the Art of Recording, Wouldn't It Be Nice, Brian Wilson and the Making of the Beach Boys' Pet Sounds, currently working on Close Enough for Love, The Life and Music of Johnny Mandel. Along with that, a record and radio producer, CD projects including Frank Sinatra in Hollywood, A Voice in Time and A Voice on the Air for Columbia Legacy, Sing and Dance with Frank Sinatra. You're starting to see a pattern. Recent projects have included remastering Sinatra's historic Hollywood Bowl performances from the 1940s. A few years ago, served as producer and mixing mastering engineer for Nancy Sinatra's weekly Nancy for Frank radio show, which is on, or then was on Sirius-XM Radio, and can currently be heard with a weekly show, Sinatra Standard Time, for the San Diego jazz station KSDS. Dana Polan is Martin Scorsese Professor of Cinema Studies and Department Chair in the Tisch School of the Arts at NYU, the author of 13 books in film and media studies, including most recently Goodfellas, monograph for the British Film Institute's Film Classic series. If you have already managed to write books on albums or singles, now you have to write a book on a film. Then you're the EGOT of authors. Uh, Also wrote about the Patty Duke Show in the American 60s, Hot Dogs and Crepe Suzette with Carol Flynn, 200 essays, reviews, and review essays, numerous DVD commentaries, former president of the Society for Cinema Studies. Let's see, knighted by the Ministry of Culture of the French government, 2003 Academy Scholar at the Academy of Motion Picture Art. I'm condensing. He regularly teaches and lectures on Frank Sinatra, and his next book project, to coincide perhaps with added time from retiring from full teaching. Congratulations for that. Next book project, Culinary Drives, A Cultural History of the Food Trucks. So I'm going to hand it off to them. I'm going to encourage people on this call to put comments of any kind and questions in particular into the chat. Elena Razlogova, another of our co-organizers, will handle the Q&A. We always tell our presenters to please, it's hard, but don't look at the chat. The chat is for later. We'll send you the transcript when we can. And with all of those things set aside, did I forget anything, Elena? That's good enough for now, right? Let's hand it off to the Chuck and Dana show. Thank you, guys.
great. Well, thank you so much for having us. We're really anxious to present in this forum to get feedback. We have questions that we would love some thoughts about. We could go on forever, so we very strongly told Eric to cut us off when need be. We do have some slides we want to make sure to show you at the end. Now, so as Eric was saying, we're co-writing a book, and I'll in a second talk about how we came to work together. I'm going to start us off, and then Chuck's going to jump in at various points. Some of you will know the Reaktion book series Reverb. It's on singers and places. Tom Kemper, who wrote a really wonderful book on the monkeys in Hollywood, is here with us. Tom's a friend of mine, and he recommended us to the Reverb series. The title of our book, I sort of think, says it all. It's Hoboken to Hollywood: The American Places of Frank Sinatra. At times, the subtitle is The American Dreams of Frank Sinatra, but we go back and forth. And it deals with several topics that overlap but aren't the same. Chuck and I had been wanting to write a book together and finally hit on this idea of writing about Sinatra and places. I should say how we came together. About 9 years ago, actually 2017, I for the first time decided to teach a course on Frank Sinatra. I was not a Frank Sinatra fan, but I was also not a Frank Sinatra fan. I just wanted to learn more about him, and often feel that the way I learn about something is to teach it. And I went online to look at what the Frank Sinatra scholarship is. By Frank Sinatra scholarship, I don't mean Kitty Kelly, but actual critical studies. And there are very few. One that came up was Sessions with Sinatra, Frank Sinatra and the Art of Recording. I didn't know the author. I found his email on the web, Chuck Granata in New Jersey. I wrote him an email saying, would you come to my class? And it was the fastest reply ever. Like a minute later, I get this, I'm so there. I live to talk about Frank Sinatra. Chuck was a former New Jersey policeman, started collecting Sinatra paraphernalia, pictures. You read any other book and they always say photographs courtesy of Chuck Granata. So we've hit it off ever since. He comes to my class. We do a public conversation about Sinatra in New Jersey with a Frank Sinatra tribute artist. We're not supposed to call them imitators. It's been great. So what we're interested in this book is several things that are not exactly the same. The first is how Frank Sinatra sings about places, diverse kinds of places, and they're not exactly always distinct. So how he sings about cities, sometimes cities that he's not in, sometimes cities that he's never been to. One long section, and Chuck, maybe we'll come back to this, is about Sinatra and small towns, even though he's very much an urbane, city guy, tough guy, cool, hip guy, Playboy pad, etc. He also, running through his work, is a fascination with small town America. I'll come back to that in a second. One of the books in the Reaktion series by the series editor, John Scanlon, is about music on the road. Sinatra obviously goes from on the road to go from place to place, but the songs of the road are small within his oeuvre. I mean, he has, for example, a song called Lonesome Road, which is a mock spiritual. He also has songs of nature. We don't talk a lot about that in the book, but it's interesting that a lot of his nature songs are very much immersed in what in literary criticism is called the pathetic fallacy. That is, the nature sort of reflects internal emotions. So it's things like willow, weep for me, ebb tide, the tide comes in, the tide goes out. There's a whole subset of songs about Southern nature, Old Man River, River, Stay Away from My Door. And there's also, and the last section is going to deal with this, there's also songs of the cosmos, Fly Me to the Moon, Lost in the Stars, etc. Now, mentioning all of this, and I'm going to turn it over to Chuck in a second. One immediate question that comes up is the extent to which we can consider Sinatra the author or the auteur of these songs, given that he doesn't write most of them. And if we're going to interpret lyrics, and we're not going to just be interpreting the lyrics, but also the musical sound, to what extent is that justified for someone who isn't the author? Right. Sinatra sings over 1,200 songs, records over 1,200. He's credited, I think, with only 1.5, is something like that.
I think officially he was cut in on 3 or 4.
Right. Yeah. But we want to argue that in many ways we can still call him the author of his songs. He inhabits his songs in many ways, from the manner of singing. He, especially for albums, chose what songs would go on an album in what order.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So do you want to talk about how he makes a Sinatra song?
Well, Frank had this unique understanding of what his audience wanted to hear. So, of course, when popular songs about locations came about, for instance, April in Paris, he would sing and record it. He would sing it in nightclubs, and then he would record it. And of course, the prime example of the success of doing something like that is the theme from New York, New York. Now, he had originally recorded a song for the film On the Town called New York, New York, which really enhanced the location of the theme of the film, or the locations, I should say, because it was plural. So when it comes to New York, the theme from New York, New York, Frank takes this anthem and turns it into a worldwide hit. And now New York itself becomes almost inextricably associated with Frank Sinatra. Sinatra now represents New York simply because he chose to sing a very popular song from a film, and now he embodies that actual tune.
Right. And one thing that's anecdotally, two things that are anecdotally interesting. One is, and we'll come back to this. Obviously, you don't need to be in the city that you sing about. And one of the great ironies is that two anthems that Sinatra sings, one is a would-be anthem, that's LA is My Lady, which I think everybody thought would do better and become like the LA equivalent of New York, New York. It doesn't do as well because the album it's on doesn't do as well.
Right.
But LA is My Lady is recorded in New York.
Yes.
Meanwhile, New York, New York, starts spreading the news, is recorded in LA. But it then becomes associated with Los Angeles, and becomes, in a sense, the city's anthem. And two anecdotes: during COVID, every night at 7, it would be played through the city in honor of first responders. So you'd suddenly hear the song coming out of off of various rooftops. It at one point was played at Yankee Stadium when the Yankees won, and Liza Minnelli's version was played at Yankee Stadium when the Yankees lost, until the Liza Minnelli's people complained, and they now only play Frank Sinatra. And it's also because NYU, we hold our undergraduate graduation at Yankee Stadium. The graduation ends with Sinatra's version of New York, New York. And one of the things, obviously, we are talking about in the book is the disconnect from the recording of a song and the place that it's recorded in. You can make New York, New York in LA.
Or Paris or London or anywhere in the world, really.
And our last chapter is going to be about, or our coda will be about, what we call the role of the virtual. Once you have a microphone, you can record a song. You can send it out on radio. So there's a disconnect from the place of performance and where it goes to.
Right.
And that, for us, culminated. And what's interesting is, Chuck talks about this a lot in sessions with Sinatra. He's in the 20th century, he's there for a lot of the revolutions in music technology, the development of the microphone, the move from acoustic to electric recording, magnetic tape, and culminating with the album that the two albums, the duets 1 and 2, which is, I assume most of you know this. It's duets with various singers that were not in the studio with Sinatra. They recorded his part of his side of the song, and then by fiber optic, they added in other singers. So that's literally across the world. Another thing to talk about, something else we want to talk about, is that it's not only in lyrics, but including lyrics. It's not only in lyrics that sometimes you can invoke a place. Ebb Tide is about the beach, and you hear the water sound, so it's evoking a place. The Chicago song, Chicago, Chicago, has a kind of honky-tonk aspect to it. Now, one thing that's interesting is, and Chuck and I were talking about this week, Sinatra is primarily a recording artist, and recording primarily, although there's a little bit of recording in Chicago, he's primarily LA and New York.
Yes.
And he's working with technicians who are very professional. He's working with musicians, especially studio musicians in LA, who are very professional and can reproduce a sound that can't necessarily be called a New York sound or an LA sound.
Right. That's a good point. In jazz, if you're a fan of modern jazz, you know that there's a distinct difference between West Coast and East Coast jazz. And that exists because of how the musicians that came out of the big bands after World War II settled on either coast. And some obviously settled in the middle of the country in Chicago, but it was primarily LA and New York that had a thriving session music scene. So they were needed in those areas the most, and that's where they gravitated towards. And the West Coast jazz musicians really developed a very distinct sound and style of playing that was influenced by their surroundings. And the same thing happened in New York. When it comes to an artist like Frank Sinatra, though, it's not like you're going into a club and the band is just making up the music as he's performing. It's more laid out and very much structured by the arranger prior to the session. And when a singer like Frank Sinatra records and sings with those backings that have been very carefully constructed, there really should be no difference between whether it was recorded with New York musicians or LA musicians or Chicago, or, if he's doing a performance, he did some recording in London. And of course, each individual arranger had a style that was unique and distinctive. But in terms of being able to say, oh, I know that record was recorded on the West Coast or the East Coast because I recognize the musician's style, is really not applicable here. But I think, of course, like many artists, Frank was inspired by these two locations. He thrived when he was in the action of a New York City, or a Los Angeles or a Chicago. The only time he really recorded in Chicago was a handful of times with the Dorsey Band back between 1940 and 1942. But in terms of his commercial recording career, most of it was done on the West Coast and the East Coast in New York and LA.
Yeah. The one exception that I'm starting to think out, and Chuck and I have been discussing this in the last week or so, to the one exception to the idea that there's no specific city sound in his music is when he goes not into recording studios, but in a couple cases in LA, he actually records in a Hollywood movie studio. And this happens in the early 60s. He records a very bombastic song about America. He records a song about California with a full orchestra that's mainly composed of Hollywood studio musicians. And this also leads to a project that he develops, I want to say 63, 64, with Nelson Riddle, which is the concert Sinatra. And that's recorded at the Goldwyn Studios with
a massive orchestra,
like 87 people,
almost 90,
and recorded not on magnetic tape, but on 35
millimeter film.
And one of the things, Chuck did a box set called Sinatra in Hollywood, and one of the things he found was elements for Sinatra musicals, in particular Anchors Aweigh, and you can hear a particular kind of studio professionalism in the recording, in part because in those cases, they're recording according to the needs of filmmaking rather than record making. Do you want to talk a little bit about Anchors Aweigh?
So with Anchors Aweigh, which Frank Sinatra filmed in 1944 and 45, mostly 45, we found elements that were recorded in a very specific technical way that we were actually able to use to create a true stereo recording. Now, stereo, the idea of a left and right channel and having this depth and the motion in a sound recording didn't really come into play until 1957, 58. But here we created, in the cases where we had the actual separated stems, which is like basically multi-track tracks, we were able to create a stereo track from these 1945 recordings. And the reason is that back in the 40s, what they had to do if they were going to emphasize a certain instrument in a motion picture. Let's say Anchors Away. Frank at one point sits at the piano and there's a close-up of him playing and singing a song called I Fall in Love Too Easily. And it's just with the piano. So if they had only recorded that audio with a single microphone way back in the studio on the soundstage, it wouldn't sound intimate, which is what they're trying to impart visually. So what they did for these recording sessions for most of the films in the 40s is they would block the orchestra into sections, maybe 3 or 4 sections, and they would put a microphone pointed towards each section, and they would record just that microphone going to one dedicated film recording machine. At the time, they actually recorded audio on full coat 35 millimeter nitrate film. So when they went back and mixed the film, when the sound editor and mixer mixed the film, he didn't do it in stereo, he did it in mono. But at that point where Frank sits at the piano, he's got this beautifully close mic'd sound of the piano and Sinatra's voice, and he brings that up in the mix, and it sounds like you're standing right next to the piano, which is the visual perspective of the scene. Likewise, if it's the Hollywood Bowl and there's a full orchestra there, they were able to get really beautiful sound, detailed sound of all the instruments because they recorded them separately and were able to adjust the volume, how much of the brass section was in the final mono mix, how much was the percussion, how much were the strings in there. Well, because in certain instances, some of these individual stems survived, we were able to bring them into the digital system and then literally use them like you would use a multi-track tape recorded in the 60s, 70s, or 80s. And we were able to create a beautiful soundstage. And that's where you hear the Hollywood sound, because on those recordings that we were able to mix in stereo, those microphones captured the room tone of the MGM soundstage, the main studio that MGM used for all those great musicals. And it was revered as a great recording space for a reason, because it had a lot of old wood in it, and it was really resonant and reverberant. And as soon as you hear these stereo recordings that we mixed, you feel the atmosphere, you feel the tone in that room, the way that room in Hollywood added to what you're hearing. So in that sense, we didn't have that kind of setup in New York City. Most of the recording until the 70s for Hollywood films was done in Hollywood. It wasn't done in New York. Right. After 1968, 69, they started recording film soundtracks, not just on magnetic tape, multi-track tape, but they would record it all around the world, and especially in New York.
Yeah. So as Chuck was just saying, there is a Hollywood sound in movie recording, yes, but not necessarily in recording for the purpose of making singles or albums.
Yeah, and I think we have to make a distinction. When we talk about a West Coast jazz sound, we're talking about the actual interpretation of the music. Right. How are the trombones and the brass combined? How are they alternating their lines? All that was endemic to the way they were orchestrated and played, literally as a piece of music. In the case of what I just explained with Sinatra, we're merely talking about the sound, the oral sound that you're hearing. So there's two very different ways of looking at it. You can look at it from a performance perspective, or you could look at it from a recording and sonic perspective. And you can definitely hear a difference in the way the Hollywood recordings for films were made.
Right. So the other side of our book, if one side is how he does or doesn't sing about places or create a sound related to a place, the other part of our book is how he inhabits cities and how his music inhabits cities. So literally what it means for Sinatra to be associated physically with a place. And there's 5 that are central to us, and then there's a couple digressions on some others. And each place in the book represents a phase of his career, in a way, a different temporality to his career. So we start with Hoboken. Remember, the title of the book is Hoboken to Hollywood. Hoboken is the past in a way. It's what Sinatra tries to flee. At first, he doesn't want Hoboken, and for a long time, Hoboken doesn't want him. Hoboken is seen as a kind of working class entrapment. Right across from it, you can see the future or the immediate future, which is New York or Manhattan. What's interesting is he doesn't really sing about Hoboken, and there really isn't a popular culture of Hoboken. I'll come back to that in a very quick second. Hoboken is the place to escape from. Interestingly, a lot of Sinatra films, more than maybe the songs, although some of the songs too, are about leaving a place, coming to a new place, very rarely staying in a place or not being able to get out of a place. It would have been interesting to imagine what would have happened if Sinatra had gotten the main role in On the Waterfront, which he militated for. I think we were just talking about this earlier, probably would have been wrong for it, but he wanted to play Terry Malloy, and that would have been a case of someone who's growing up in Hoboken, and when he succeeds at the end, it's clear he's never going to leave Hoboken. That's going to be his life.
And the other thing, the other part of that particular situation is that a large part of On the Waterfront was actually filmed in Hoboken.
Right.
So the reason that he really wanted that part was because he felt he lived it. He experienced that growing up, the turmoil of the docks. Those were his neighbors. The dock workers were his neighbors. He understood the politics of what the waterfront meant because his mom had been involved with many of the political events that were local to them in the Bergen County area and in Hoboken. So
yeah. And then a broader point, and again, if anybody has thoughts about this, one of the reasons I think Sinatra, besides the fact that Hoboken is what he wants to get away from, Hoboken doesn't really have a national place in American popular culture, in part because another city across from Manhattan does, and that's Brooklyn. And Brooklyn very quickly becomes Sinatra's small town near Manhattan.
Yes.
He plays in a film called It Happened in Brooklyn, where he's carrying around what we think is a picture. He says, "This is a picture of my sweetheart." And when he opens the little locket, it's a picture of the Brooklyn Bridge. And he sings an on-location song to the Brooklyn Bridge.
Filmed on the Brooklyn Bridge.
In Happened in Brooklyn. And then in Anchors Away, which is nominally set in LA, and there's some location stuff. He's come from Brooklyn. And he meets a woman in a restaurant who recognizes his Brooklyn accent. He recognizes her Brooklyn accent. At the end of the film, after falling in love with the wrong woman, he realizes he's in love with the girl from Brooklyn, who all that matters is that she's from Brooklyn.
I think he calls her Brooklyn.
Right. Well, she doesn't get a name in the credit. She's the girl from Brooklyn.
Yeah.
And the nurse in It Happened at the Brooklyn Bridge doesn't get her name.
Right.
And I think part of what we think is that this idea of Brooklyn as small town then disperses into other small towns that run through Sinatra's career. So if any of you know the film Suddenly, in which he plays a would-be presidential assassin, he arrives in a small town. Some Came Running is about living in a small town. Now, there's two exceptions to the idea that he can't ever leave or doesn't ever leave. One is, and they're both don't do well. One is a film, and that's The Miracle of the Bells, where he plays a priest, which, Sinatra should not play a priest.
In a mining town.
In a mining town. He's
very
grown up
small.
Right. He's grown up in that town, clearly will never leave that town.
Right.
And because he's a priest, he's sort of neutered in a way. The other is an album that Sinatra does in 1970, Watertown, where he plays a small town guy. And counterintuitively, it's his wife who's left him for the big city, and he's lamenting her absence, but clearly will never leave small town America.
Right.
Other than that, Sinatra is about comings and goings, going to new places. So the other chapters of our book, the next after Hoboken is Manhattan, right across the river, where he both triumphs at first in 1943, the Paramount presentations of the Bobby Soxers, and then he falls really hard in the late 40s. Some of that's also in LA, but a lot of it's in New York, where suddenly he's not filling houses.
Right.
There's a famous anecdote. Sammy Davis Jr. says he sees Sinatra walking along the street and no one's mobbing him. Right. Then Hollywood, it's a place of rebirth. His career takes off. He builds himself his first bachelor pad. And Edward R. Murrow, if you get a chance to see it, it's on YouTube. You can look at this. Edward R. Murrow does a very famous link. Murrow's in New York, where he
Right.
shows, or Sinatra shows him his new bachelor pad. This idea of the one floor, every part of the building communicates with every part. Hollywood also leads, even though he's clearly using the house in Beverly Hills as a respite from life in the fast lane in Hollywood. He's also performing in Hollywood at Ciro's and other places. Ciro's restaurant has a cameo in Meet Danny Wilson.
Right.
He obviously records a lot in various studios, most famously Capitol. Do you want to talk about the Capitol building a little bit?
Well, sure. I mean, anyone who's been to Los Angeles and loves music knows the Capitol Tower. It's such a iconic part of that Hollywood skyline. But Frank started recording at Capitol Records in 1953, when the studio was on Melrose Avenue. And for, gosh, it was almost 15 years. That was the only place he recorded, was at Capitol Records, and then what used to be known as United Western in Hollywood. And those two studios were his primary locales for recording. And he didn't come back and do a session in New York until 1967, which is, quite a big gap. I think that was out of convenience. Capitol really didn't have a New York studio. But what's interesting is that even though he recorded in Capitol for that extended period of time, he was traveling back and forth doing live performance, not just in New York and Chicago, and we're going to talk in a moment about Las Vegas, but also around the world. So, here he's doing all sorts of things: film, television, radio, recording sessions, and he's going around the world to do these things, but he primarily stays anchored in Los Angeles for his recordings, because that's where he lives. That was his home of record from around 1944 until he died.
Right. And
even though he maintained places in New York City.
Right. And the Edward R. Murrow documentary ends with Sinatra showing him around, and suddenly we hear a car, the horn honking,
Right.
because he's got to be driven to the airport to go to Las Vegas to
Right.
perform at the Sands. So you
Right.
get the sense of the bachelor pad in LA is his headquarters,
Yes.
but it's also a place from which you go out
Right.
to other places.
If you want to check that out, that is the Edward R. Murrow Person to Person with
Right.
Frank Sinatra.
Yes,
It's really,
really
it's neat.
Yeah. Now, what's interesting is Sinatra then needs a break from his getaway. So while he's in LA, he's also going on certain weekends to Palm Springs. Palm Springs, we originally thought was going to be a small interlude, and it's now sort of ballooned into a bigger chapter. And it's has a curious position in Sinatra's career. He does perform some charity events. It looks like he may have done one or two radio shows, but for the most part, he sees Las Vegas as a break from the performing life. He will sit by the pool and read scripts. He does have some recording equipment in his first bachelor pad. Actually, all his bachelor pads are, well, his pads, because he's married in one of them.
Right.
There's very few songs about Palm Springs. He does do a song about a place close to Palm Springs, 29 Palms.
Yes.
But it's about a woman who grew up in 29 Palms, and has clearly left for the big city because she has 29 Cadillacs and 29 mink stoles
Right.
from Saks.
And that song really, in a way, was a throwaway, because it was something that came to him on the hit parade in the late 40 edition, 47, 48, and he had to sing it. I don't think he would have chosen that.
Right. And one of Sinatra's we consider one of his greatest songs exists almost as in part because it's not a Palm Springs recorded song, and that's the famous "I've Got You Under My Skin,"
Right.
where Sinatra has finished recording all the songs for the album on a Wednesday. They're going to drive on Friday morning, I think it is, to Palm Springs, and suddenly Thursday morning he wakes up and says, the album's not complete. I need one more song. He calls Nelson Riddle and says, write an arrangement. They call back in all the studio musicians, and they record Thursday night, rushing to get it done because Sinatra wants to leave the next morning for Palm Springs. So they're in Capitol.
Yes.
They do what, 29 takes of it?
22 takes of I've Got You Under My Skin.
And they finally get it, and he leaves for his weekend.
And by the way, then that tune, that specific recording actually becomes the absolute pivot point for Sinatra's career. So he comes out of that downturn that Dana spoke about earlier. He begins with a fresh start at Capitol Records in Hollywood in 53, and he spends 53, 54, and 55 kind of refitting and refreshing and reimagining his image and his art, his craft. And by 56, January of 56, when he goes into the studio to do this first full big band album with Nelson Riddle, I've Got You Under My Skin actually becomes the pivot point and basically cements the image that he has so carefully crafted in the 3 years before of this swinging sophisticate. And that's really, that moment is really the defining moment for the Frank Sinatra that we think of. The guy with the, the snap brim hat, the loosened tie, that kind of, jaunty, sophisticated, let loose and have fun kind of attitude, which pervaded the rest of the 50s and 60s for him. And a lot of that was, enhanced and amplified for the public by where he was, which kind of leads us to Las Vegas.
Right, which, Palm Springs has a kind of timelessness to it. You're out in the desert, there's cacti, there's rocks, you can see the hills, and there's a kind of sense of permanence.
Right.
Vegas is timeless in a very different way, which is you're indoors. As you all know this, but famously in Las Vegas, there are no clocks, there are no windows, so you can gamble nonstop. Sinatra will joke, and he does stage routines where he'll say, I have no idea what the weather is like outside. What's going on? Nancy, his daughter, he'll say, she told me it's raining out or it's sunny or whatever. There's something called Las Vegas blue, which is the color of the sky when you've been up all night and emerge from the casino just for a moment.
Right.
And you see that at the end of Ocean's 11 when they come out of the casino.
Right.
The pun we use at one point in the book is in Palm Springs, he's a resident. In Las Vegas, he's in residency. He goes there for a number of shows. And again, going back to what we were saying before, there's not really what we might call a Las Vegas sound, although Las Vegas shows tend to be splashy, big sound.
Well, they used a smaller orchestra. So, when Sinatra was appearing at the Sands in Las Vegas, there wasn't a huge string section. If this is back in the 1950s and early 60s to the mid 60s, if there was a string section at all, a lot of times they'd have a smaller string section and basically a jazz band. And certainly by the time he was performing in Las Vegas in the mid 60s with Count Basie, at the point where they recorded a number of shows, which came out as that truly spectacular album, Sinatra Live at the Sands, there is a genuine spark that you can hear that is unmistakably Las Vegas. And it's not necessarily the sound of what was being played so much as we talked about earlier, but it's the energy.
Right.
There's a certain energy, a certain, kick, because he was in a place where he could cut loose and gamble and do his ring-a-ding-dinging and have fun. And that was all part of the image and the branding of the Rat Pack. Those movies like Ocean's 11 and Robin and the Seven Hoods were coming out. So he was literally playing the part that he had created in Las Vegas.
Right. And you see that also with, so we mentioned this in the book at one point, you see this with other performers who have to take on a specific Las Vegas sound. And the famous one is Elvis, who when he first plays Las Vegas, bombs because he's doing a small group, country, almost rockabilly. Right. And then the colonel says, no, we need splash. Right. We need big, you in big suits. We need more of an orchestra. We also, I'll mention, we do talk in passing about some other places. Atlantic City, where Sinatra will start to play in the 50s. And then importantly, in the 70s, another gambling city, but very different from Vegas. He sings one song about Atlantic City in the 40s, which is on the boardwalk in Atlantic City.
On the radio.
On the radio, no, so it's not a recording. He also has, and we're just working on this now, interludes with Miami Beach, where he will go and start performing again, kind of the big Vegas-y sound, but in Miami Beach,
right?
At the Fontainebleau. Some of you will know, of course, of Elvis, his show where he has Elvis does his first TV show after the Army. Right. That's filmed actually in Florida. You wouldn't tell it.
Yeah.
You couldn't tell that from the show, but it's in Florida.
Yeah, now, so it's a different vibe than Las Vegas, and unfortunately, it doesn't seem like many recordings, if any, exist from those Florida shows that he did, especially in the 60s. We've never found any. Right. In any case, but that would be interesting to compare the vibe and how the audience reacted based on the location, because Miami Beach in the 60s was a very different place, although it was just as vibrant as Las Vegas, but they didn't have the gambling, and people were a little looser in Vegas, I think. Yeah. And it would be an interesting comparison. I wish we had some recording from there.
You can see some of the difference if you know the film he makes at the beginning of the 60s, High Hopes. Is that the name of it?
No, it's called
Hole in the Head.
Yeah, High Hopes was written for that film.
Right. Okay. One of Frank Capra's last. We're gonna stop in a second.
I'm really sorry to interrupt, but you wanted to show the slides.
Yes, so let's go to that.
Let's just go ahead and do that, because we have lots of questions.
Okay, let me.
Guys.
Sorry. How do I get out of that? Okay, give me 1 second. I'm not techno, so bear with me. Are you seeing that?
No.
Okay.
Share the screen.
Yeah, you have to share the screen.
Okay.
Share. Here.
Yeah, we're seeing it now.
Okay, great.
So this is you should be seeing the cover to Come Fly With Me, an album about travel, about cosmopolitanism, this kind of great sexist cover where Sinatra is saying goodbye to one person, beckoning the next person to join him on his trip, with the jet behind him.
Wait, you have to go into PowerPoint. You're just showing.
Oh, okay. There you go.
Okay.
All right.
Okay, then slideshow.
Okay.
Good thing we have tech assistants, because I'm a Zoom idiot, believe it or not, and an iPhone idiot. I can't figure it out.
Okay.
Is that better?
Can you all see that?
Yes.
Okay, so what's interesting about Come Fly With Me, which will end the introduction of the book, is even though it seems to be a cosmopolitan album, Come Fly With Me is the opening song, the very last song is about LA and New York. And it's fun to go traveling, but it's really fun to come home. And home is defined as neither New York nor LA, but the two together.
Right.
This is Hoboken looking out at Manhattan. So you can see how close, and you can see if Sinatra was standing there, how he could dream of this place across the river, imposing, but also a kind of thing to surmount, to go to. This is his star in Hoboken. About 10 years ago, you can see how ratty it looks. Hoboken sort of ignored him. It was in front of a sleazy bar called From Here to Eternity, which no longer exists.
Can't make it up.
This, in contrast, is a fake star at the Hoboken Historical Society, which is all about how great Sinatra is. And they're like trying to recuperate him by a upscale clean star. And Hoboken has been going through gentrification. So this is his birthplace. When I viewed it 10 years ago, it was a parking lot. Now it's an upscale condos called Old Blue Eyes. And that star that we saw on the ground that was ratty has now been put on the wall. This is, and I apologize for the quality of this. This is Sinatra's Beverly Hills, or in the hills.
It was up at the top of Coldwater Canyon.
Coldwater Canyon. And you can see there's Edward R. Murrow in the foreground. The house is one level. Again, everything communicates with everything else. Sort of post-war modernism with lots of glass, lots of sliding doors. This is a weird moment where Murrow says, how do you entertain? And he says, well, I have two houseboys.
Right.
And he simply opens the door and pulls in these houseboys. So we see the hidden labor. They get to say nothing, and then he goes past them. He's on the move constantly in the video. It's 11 minutes long, and he's on the run as if he's such a busy guy. This is him showing off, again, very post-war, his tech system, TV and radio, reel-to-reel recorders. This is what we were alluding to before, and many of you have seen this. The Capitol building, which some people don't think is supposed to represent a stack of records. I think most people believe it is, with the spindle in the center, although it's slightly off center,
Right.
but it's supposed to be the stack of records. In a way, post-war modernist architecture, but instead of, say, the rectangle of the Seagram's building and just geometry, here there's also a kind of postmodern that the building is going to reflect what's inside it,
Right.
which is the world of records,
Right.
the entertainment
This was
industry.
that was a very innovative design in
Yeah.
1955 when they started it.
Yeah. This is Sinatra's star, one of his 3 stars. And I should mention all of these are photos that are going in the book.
Yeah.
This is one of his 3 stars in Hollywood. He has one for recording, one for movies, and curiously, one for TV.
Mm-hmm.
This is when I checked in. I did some of the field research for our book. When I checked into my hotel in Palm Springs, this was the magazine. And I like the fact that there's all these figures associated with Palm Springs, including Liberace without a shirt on, Cary Grant, Steve McQueen, Elvis Presley, but Sinatra's the biggest face. I got a chance to visit his first bachelor pad, which was Twin Palms, built in the mid-50s, named for these 2 palms, which because he came down for the weekend, but it wasn't always clear what weekend he would be in Palm Springs. He might have other engagements. He would hoist a Jack Daniels flag between the 2 palms, and that would announce that Frank Sinatra's in town. This is the pool, and I don't know how well you can see it. It was designed in the shape of a piano. There's some suggestion that the walkway creates the keys of a piano, but in fact, they're in the wrong place, if that's true. But this is how you go from the northern street into the house. This is the front of the house. Again, one level, lots of glass.
Now, this was actually built, I think, Dana, around 47.
Yes, yeah.
And I mean, if you look at this architecture, this very mid-century modern, it was really just starting.
Right. Yeah.
And Frank, I think I know that Frank was brought to Palm Springs by his buddy, the composer Jimmy Van Heusen, who wrote All the Way and so many of the great Sinatra hits, High Hopes, etc. But Sinatra then brought people like Bing Crosby. So Sinatra was one of the first big Hollywood people to really settle in Palm Springs and discover it and help encourage it to become a thriving community for artists and
and this house was the first domestic commission for the architect E. Stewart Williams, who had built office buildings.
Right.
And evidently Sinatra came to him and said, I want a colonial thing with columns. And Williams was, no, we have to be hip, we have to be up to date. And he said,
which was really cutting edge in 47.
Yeah, and it hasn't dated. This is the audio section of Twin Palms, Twin Palms.
Right.
So Sinatra doesn't record professionally, but he could try things out.
Yeah, this is actually his equipment and the setup that was in that house from the 40s, late 40s. It's still there. It's pretty amazing.
This is a longer view of the living room. This is the purple, what's it called? The purple room. It's a bar near all of this, and it's all now Sinatra themed.
So it's part of the house?
No, this is the purple room. It's a bar.
That's the name of the bar. Okay.
Yeah. And so here you have Elvis on Frank Sinatra's show, and all through the bar are Sinatra slogans. So here it's alcohol may be man's worst enemy, but the Bible says love your enemy. This is Las Vegas. This is the place that the Sands Hotel stood on. And Las Vegas is a city of forgetting. It forgets its past. You will find little traces. So here, there's a memento to the fact that the Sands Hotel stood on this spot. But it's now surrounded by the Venetian. And in fact, I had a real hard time finding this because no one on the staff of the Venetian knew where the Sinatra plaque was.
The marker was.
Where the marker
incredible.
was. This is in the Steve Wynn Hotel. This is the Sinatra restaurant with orange tablecloths because that was Sinatra's favorite color. This is a dessert I had there, which is a chocolate fedora.
The signature fedora.
Yes. And that's our last image, Sinatra performing in the studio. So
that's the Capitol Tower. This was taken around 1960, and it's Studio A.
All right. So that's our presentation.
All right. Thank you so much. It was so fascinating. Okay. I think Alex was first.
Sure. First off, really great talk. Interested in this project. Looking forward to reading the book. I was sort of curious if you could contextualize Frank's relationship to the city song and like the city song as the cities, or I don't know if it's called a city song, but songs about cities. Like, to what extent is he like kind of on the vanguard of that, or is it part of a larger tradition?
That's a great question. Well, in the overarching canon that we consider to be the American popular songbook, which consists of songs that were written certainly pre-1930, but for the most part between 1930 and let's say 1960, when you had really, really talented songwriters writing for Broadway and for films. They started writing about cities because, if you're writing for a film, let's say about Paris, you want to write a romantic song that glamorizes being in Paris with someone you love. So you write a song like April in Paris, which was written in the very late 40s, 47, I believe. And, that really, when you think about the songs that have survived, they're mostly love songs. Almost all of them are based on some romantic notion. And they often drew on the location that was being espoused and was the theme of the film or even the Broadway musical. So it made sense that singers would start taking these songs from the plays and then the films and basically making them standalones that became hits. And so Sinatra sings about Paris, and he sings the songs from Oklahoma, Oh, What a Beautiful Morning, and he sings the songs from Carousel, which give you the sense of what it was like, to be a person who works as a barker in Maine, right? I mean, so you get a sense of these places. So, the greatest example is the one that we already mentioned, which is New York, New York, theme from New York, New York, which is the official name of the 1979 song that Liza made popular. But, that is probably the greatest example of Frank literally inhabiting the song and becoming just enmeshed with its history and what it represented to the world. People hear about New York City and they immediately think of New York, New York, and Frank Sinatra's recording of that or performance of that. He did it in other places. April in Paris was an important song that he recorded.
Moonlight in Vermont.
Moonlight in Vermont, he helped make a classic. A song called I Love Paris, which Cole Porter wrote for Can Can. He kept these songs in his repertoire and recorded them and re-recorded them for decades. So, this whole sense of place. He had sung Chicago, That Toddlin' Town, which is a very early song. It went back to, I believe, 1929. But then when he does Robin and the Seven Hoods in 1964, he has Sammy Cahn and Jimmy Van Heusen write a song called my kind of town, Chicago is. So, he keeps bringing these places that he likes
Right.
back into the musical fold, and they just became,
Right.
inextricably linked to Sinatra because they became hits that he sang
Again,
hundreds and thousands of times in front of audiences.
I know we have other questions, but I just want to add in. I mean, remember, this is someone who's recorded 1,200 songs, and not everything he sings is recorded. Some
Right.
are radio, and we only have them because of the radio shows. Chuck was mentioning, how many of his songs are about romance. I mean, on your radio show,
Right.
you talk about he has 4 songs whose title is "I Love You." So romance is central,
Right.
and romance then becomes either connected to places or in a way disconnected. So it's
Right.
connected. It's love is a place where love was lost or love was found, or love can be regained if you
Right.
go back.
Well,
Take-
yeah, Watertown was a great example, but there's another album called A Man Alone, which was based on poems written by Rod McEwen. And in that, basically concept album, Sinatra sings a song called Lonesome Cities. So, here he is and he's in the big city, but he's lonesome. So there's all kinds of,
balances.
tentacles that reach back to places.
Right. And there's also even on Come Fly With Me, there's a suggestion that if love is strong enough, you don't need to be in any particular place.
Right.
And that's the song Around the World
Yes.
based on Around the World in 80 Days,
Yeah.
where he says, I was in this place, I was in London town, I was in Paris, I was here, I was there, but I found my love in you. I
Right.
no longer need to go around the world
Right.
because I have found my love in you. So, okay,
great.
other questions?
Great.
Sorry, we're verbose. Sorry about that.
That's amazing. Great. So Jonathan, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, thanks so much for sharing this project with us. We watched a little of Sinatra in this 57 film called The Pride and the Passion, where he plays a Spanish guerrilla fighter named Miguel. He's wearing a horrible wig. He
Yeah.
has a little bronzing. And it made me think about this question. How can we think about the differences of an actor portraying another identity? Obviously a hot topic of conversation and discussion, often based in place, and a singer's relationship with place.
I think that's a great question. And I will say, yes. I mean, to me, that was a reach. That wasn't Sinatra's greatest role, that's for sure. But, I think for him, because he was such a curious guy and he loved the culture of music. So if you look at his discography, as early as the early 40s, he's singing Latin tunes, Besame Mucho, and then the Coffee Song. And then he continues on, and
It happened in Monterey.
It happened in Monterey in the mid 50s. And then he does 2 full albums of bossa nova. And I think that it was his love of the music from those places that kind of gave him that connection. Although it's such a bad role. I mean, that's definitely not a great Sinatra film.
Right. In the book, we try when we can to avoid just being Kitty Kelly gossipy or anecdotal, but sometimes we have to talk about those. And Sinatra has a very complicated relation with Spain. It's where Ava Gardner left him for a bullfighter and then another bullfighter. And there was this period when he was singing,
Definitely.
I get no kick from champagne. And
Right.
there's a lyric about Spain.
Right.
And starting with he'd do this sneer like Spain.
Or he'd go, yuck.
Yeah. Because of her.
Yeah.
I don't know if we answered that one.
I mean, does that make sense? I'm not sure if I really answered it, but
No,
Great question. I mean, the other thing that's interesting with Sinatra and the movies are a kind of complicated relation to songs and movies. There are movies that are fully dramatic. There are movies where someone else is the musician. So in From Here to Eternity, he sings a little bit in the shower, like a couple bars.
Yeah.
But it's Montgomery Clift who gets on the trumpet and
Right,
plays. In Man with a Golden Arm, he's a drummer, not a singer.
I have an example that I think is probably the best example I can think of right now. In 1962, at the end of a really spectacular world tour that Frank did on the behalf of
UNESCO.
sick children,
Right.
he went to London and arranged to record an album with the Canadian British arranger, Robert Farnon. And he wanted to do that specifically because now we talk about location. Well, it wasn't the fact that Farnon was in England. It was the fact that Farnon had a reputation as someone who lived in England, who had come from Canada, of writing beautifully, if not better than anyone, for strings. And Frank loves strings. And, every musician that I'm close to, every arranger that I've interviewed, Johnny Mandel, Billy May, I mean, I could just go on and on. When I talk to them about writing for strings, they immediately say, no one wrote for strings or taught me more about writing for strings than Robert Farnon. So Sinatra knew Farnon's work and clearly wanted that beautiful, lush, yet lean and perfectly phrased sound that Farnon accomplished between his orchestrations and the musicians he used. So he arranged to do a full album with Farnon in London, recorded at CTS Studio in Bayswater. And, it was all British songs. It's called Great Songs from Great Britain. So,
but again, it doesn't necessarily sound British.
No.
The lyrics sometimes reference.
Yeah, so it's all British songs, but what's fascinating is that he uses a genuine British orchestra with one of the leading arrangers that's so highly regarded by all the Hollywood people and the New York people and everyone, to do the arrangements. So, I mean, to me, that's got a connection there. Like that was I think his most purposeful and exacting project, where he said, this is going to be a distinctly British record. As a matter of fact, the album was not originally released in the United States for several years. It only came out in Britain. So interesting tidbit about it.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you. Eric, do you want to ask your question?
Sure, it's a little impish. So I was thinking about the Star Trek The Next Generation series, as one does during a Frank Sinatra talk, and how they had a Sinatra impersonator on the holodeck. And I wanted to ask about place in terms of impersonation, fakery, and so on. Having grown up a rock kid of scenes and subcultures, Chicago blues, Haight-Ashbury hippies, New York hip hop,
Right.
I would have always assumed that the last thing Frank Sinatra music was about was specific places, so much as a kind of, just to push the point, fake Hollywood, Tin Pan Alley imagination of what later music made more visceral and real. And to the, again, I'm just playing impish question because I want to push you guys a little. And to the extent I would have seen place in Sinatra, I would have said Sinatra went to darker places than, say, Bing Crosby went.
Much darker.
And so place in that case is like One for the Road, and it's so essentially the question I'm sort of asking is, are you, in a way, and this is very much the current project in popular music studies, restoring a sense of place that was kind of laughed at a little bit by the rock and roll generation?
I actually think there's a number of different questions in what you're asking.
Yeah.
Well, it's occupational habit.
Are we talking about going to a place in terms of emotionality?
Mm-hmm.
Because that's a big, I mean, if you think about it, any artist strives to bring the listener into an emotional place, maybe where they're not comfortable, maybe which is too painful for them, but that's the goal. And Sinatra did it better than anyone, because it's all about emotionality.
Right.
Now, was it Hollywood? I mean, I posed this question to Mitch Miller, who worked with Frank at the end of the Columbia era. And I said, to me, when Frank is behind that microphone, that is the genuine Frank Sinatra. Everything, all the artifice, all the bullshit, all the, the fakery and acting stops. It's really him bringing this well of emotion that he's felt to the lyric. And Mitch Miller looked at me and he said, I think that's bullshit. He said, I think it's contrived, and any artist can stand there and make you feel like they're really feeling what they're singing about. And I disagreed with him. I think many artists move us emotionally. But when you listen to Sinatra singing these devastatingly sad and gloomy songs like When No One Cares and I Can't Get Started and Only the Lonely, it does bring you into that emotional space, even if you're at a very happy moment in your day, in your life. I mean, so that to me is a great example.
Yeah.
I mean, and then the other thing, not to take away from Dana's time, but I don't know, raise your hand if you ever saw Frank Sinatra live in the 80s, 90s, early 2000s. I mean, I saw him probably a couple dozen times or more, everywhere from New York to Vegas and Reno. And I have to tell you, man, I don't care if you were sitting in the first tier at the Meadowlands, in the 10th row at Radio City, or at the lip of the stage, as I did for one concert at the Sands in Atlantic City. When Frank went into New York, after 4 minutes, everyone was on their feet, cheering, yelling. And if that's not bringing the locale and what that represents, that energy to the performance, I mean, it was genuine. I don't think you can go out and do that in a contrived way. And I think Frank knew the importance of place. He sang about home and being home and his mother. And, I mean, of course, someone else wrote the lyrics, but he embraced those songs.
Right. The two things I would add, and it's a great set of questions, is that I think there's an overlap, but maybe a difference between concrete cartographic places that you could locate on a map and symbolic resonances.
Mhm.
So, for example, there is New York, but there's a New York that's different from the mapping of mapped New
Right.
York. And that's, for example, the New York of film noir, which could be done on a studio set and most likely was done out on a studio set.
Right.
When you look at, and you mentioned one for my baby, one for the road, it looks like New York. If you look at the TV where he sings it in a bar, it's a New York of the mind. It's a symbolic New York. And in that respect, what's interesting is that in some cases, you see that overlap specifically with the cities we're talking about. When you were mentioning Star Trek, and I don't know that example, I'll ask you about it more. The one I was thinking of is Blade Runner 2049, where when the Ryan Gosling character gets to ruined Las Vegas, there's a holograph of Frank Sinatra singing, I forget which song, and so it's associating Sinatra with, I mentioned before, Las Vegas forgets itself. It also is a city of endless creative destruction. Things are torn down to make way for other things. And it's playing on that meaning of Las Vegas and the meaning of Sinatra as a figure of Las Vegas.
Right.
Cool. Thank you. And forgive me.
No, not at all. That's
These are
great.
all great questions. And
and I just in passing, we're not going to deal a lot, but we do have some lines about Sinatra tribute artists, Sinatra impersonators. When I was in Vegas, and I don't want to go on about this, I actually walked like a mile away from the Strip to go see Michael Sinatra, his grandson, do a Sinatra show. I won't say more than that.
yeah,
It was kind of,
yeah.
it was like
Better
Bill,
left unsaid.
yeah, it was like Bill Murray on Saturday Night Live doing the Lounge Lizard thing. We should let some others.
Yeah,
questions.
go ahead. Go ahead. I just lost my train of thought anyway.
Carl, are you still here? Carl Wilson?
Yeah, I'm here. Just a sec. Oh, there I am.
Carl.
Hi, Carl.
Hi. Yeah, I was thinking when you were talking about Palm Springs that when you set things up, you were talking about kind of a dialectic between small town and big city running through his career. But at the same time, like Sinatra's peak was at the peak of suburbanization post-war, in the 50s. And I wonder if you see musically a representation of that kind of refurbishment of the American dream in that period in his music from then, compared to the sort of big city swingers stuff of the 40s and earlier 50s.
I'll start and then
Yeah, go ahead.
So a couple things. One is Sinatra does move away from Palm Springs, not far, but he goes to Rancho Mirage, which is a little further east and a little more exclusive. Twin Palms is a small fenced-in or walled-in space. What he has in Rancho Mirage is a 2-acre compound with a main building, with little casitas, very, very different and much more ambitious. But also there's a kind of fleeing from Palm Springs, which I think the stars that Chuck was talking about, they start to worry that Palm Springs is becoming too suburban and too touristy.
Right.
And one place, very quickly, one place where you can see Twin Palms is in a movie called The Damned Don't Cry. It's a post-war film noir with Joan Crawford, where Sinatra lent it to Joan Crawford to use as her gangster boyfriend in the film as his place, which is strange because it's right when Sinatra's being accused of mafia connections and he lends his house for a mafia movie. But you see, you can see Twin Palms, and the film starts, it's in flashback. There's a murder scene at Twin Palms, and there's all this hoi polloi standing outside. There's a guy wearing nothing but a bathing suit, and they're all they're gawking. They're clearly the
riffraff.
The riffraff. And there's like, what happened inside there? And it's almost like you can see why Sinatra would have wanted to move away from that. I think there's also in some of the films in the 50s a battle for the soul of America that gets worked out in some of the films. Suddenly, very much the film I was mentioning before, Suddenly is about Sinatra coming into small town America, and small town America has to figure out what to do with this evil figure, and it's basically kill him off. The other extreme, and it's not suburbia, well, it sort of is suburbia, is the musical Young at Heart with Doris Day, where Doris Day is a small town girl, and Sinatra comes into he's a composer, arranger who shows up, and he brings in all this cynicism and negativity and suicidal impulses. And it's based on a film, Four Daughters of John Garfield, where the character actually commits suicide. In Sinatra's version, he's saved, and at the end, he's sitting next to Doris Day at the piano, and they're singing a song together, and it's glowing. So it's suburbia has won out, and it's won out over urban evils.
So I think it's important to remember that the Sinatra influence was not merely musical. If you take 1956 as a snapshot, it's post-war. We're 11 years, past the end of World War II. And by that point, Sinatra has peaked as a crooner in the 40s, a popular romantic singer. He's had his downfall and he's returned. But that return was probably the most spectacular comeback that anybody had. And I think it was the most influential. So now, the effects of after the war and the prosperity that starts to come back to America and the economy and the world really is starting to really, get traction. And here comes Sinatra, and he's this jaunty, carefree, celebrity that creates this aura of, hey, isn't life great? We have everything at our disposal, and we can have a nice lifestyle and
And I would say it's not just he creates an aura; he creates a kind of background soundtrack.
Yes,
because you're going back to your point about suburbia. If you're in one of these tract homes with and you're GI Bill, upward mobility, you're buying big fat middle-brow novels by Herman Wouk and whatever. You also want all the Sinatra albums, and you want to be playing them.
Yeah.
So
and you could have a cocktail hour when you came home from work, right? He affected fashion. When you think of that image, as we saw on the cover of Come Fly With Me, that was Frank in the 1950s. He wore the hats like that. He wore the loosened tie, the suit. He cultivated a completely different image than what he had cultivated in the 40s, which was also bow ties and suits, but that was also emulated. And I think that he had several peaks, and those peaks definitely inspired people everywhere to act like Frank. I mean, we still have younger people in their 20s who are trying to be like Frank Sinatra today because they have kind of picked up on that Rat Pack image.
Right.
And, so I think it's something that is not just confined to music, it's confined to fashion and the way it's really called lifestyle. That's
Right.
what it would be today. And I think it transcends location,
Yeah.
honestly.
And I'll just say very, very, very quickly, one place where I see this happening is in the song from Songs for Swinging Lovers, the second to last song, Anything Goes,
Right.
which is a Cole Porter song, but he totally makes it a Sinatra song.
Right.
It starts slow, it becomes more dynamic. At first, he's dismayed. We're in a world where four-letter words are being used, but by the end, he's sort of hip and happy
Right.
that anything goes. And the second to last line is, may I say before this record swings to a close, I want you to know anything goes. And that's not in the original. That was
Right.
added.
It's like the tacit blessing. Hey, it's okay to live this,
right. And
swingers lifestyle.
and you've got it right.
I don't mean that in the sexual sense, but that,
Yeah.
Carousing, going to bars,
You
hanging
gotta-
out, with your friends.
Right. You've got to close the deal, the
Right.
amorous deal,
Right.
before this record swings to a close.
Right.
You put it on your hi-fi and you got to rush.
Yeah, it's pretty wild.
I don't know if we're running out of time, but I would love to hear more questions.
We are, Eric, are we running out of time? It sounds like we are.
Well, we're happy to answer.
Well, there's one person who wanted to ask a question who left, but I have a question, which I didn't ask. And my question was about when Sinatra became a star. You already described, you kind of answered it when you talked about that British record, when he chose specific to work with specific musicians. How often did that happen? Once he became a star, he obviously could command anybody to collaborate with. Did he have like a was he an editor of his own records by
Absolutely.
then at that point?
That question, that publicly unanswered question, was the reason I wrote my book. I wanted to peel back all the layers of the creative process so that people understood how much Frank had a hand in his recordings. Because, a lot of singers, and I hate to use this as an example, but it's true, Nat Cole was a phenomenal vocalist, right up there with Sinatra. Unique, wonderful voice, great musical intuition. He was, unlike Sinatra, an instrumentalist before he was a singer. But, Nat would essentially leave the song choices to his producers. And they would come in and say, okay, Nat, this is what we're recording today. And they'd hand him the songs. And honestly, if you look at Nat's catalog, there are a fair number of dogs, not great songs, much lesser than what Nat could have sung and should have sung, alongside some bona fide, truly magnificent songs. Sinatra always had this penchant for really digging in and picking the very best songs. And also that extended to, okay, I'm doing a record and I'm going to plan an album. So I want to pick these great songs, but who is the best arranger to actually do the instrumental backings? And by the way, I envision having this very lonely, mysterious atmosphere in this tune. Who's the trombonist who would give me that very, gloomy sound? How would they impart that so my listener can actually visualize the depth of despair I'm in? Frank oversaw everything when it came to his recordings. So he really functioned, and this was the whole premise of my book. Frank Sinatra controlled and functioned as his own producer at a time when that wasn't done by an artist. He was really one of the first, if not the first artist to go to his label, Capitol Records, and say, I want to start my own imprint under the Capitol umbrella. And they basically, the Capitol Records president, who was there at the time, told me this story. He said, I looked at him and I said, Frank, I can't do that because if I give you a label, I have to give one to Nat and Judy and Dean. Everybody's going to want their own imprint. So Frank said, okay, screw you. And 2 years later, he started his own record label, Reprise Records, So he could have even more control. He wanted to record with Duke Ellington and Count Basie and Antonio Carlos Jobim. And he said, screw it, I'll sign them to my label and I'll work with anybody I want because I'll own the label. They can't tell me what to do. He was really forward thinking when it came to that. Now, every artist, even in their opening deals, Billie Eilish, I'm sure that in her first deal, she got her own imprint. And that's the way it is now. But Frank was the first to do it.
And the question of authorship, just a minor example, the first song on Come Fly With Me, the title song, was written for that album. It didn't pre-exist. So, Sinatra is literally not the writer. He's not the lyricist, but it's written for him. And there's a way in which they're anticipating what a Sinatra song should be. So in a way, he's writing the song, even if he's not writing it.
Yeah. And I mean, he had such a close relationship with his arrangers and many of the musicians, and certainly the songwriters, that, he could really communicate what he wanted. Come Fly With Me is a great example. He goes to Sammy Kahn and Jimmy Van Heusen and says, hey, I want to do this song about traveling, the jet set, basically. And they come up with a custom written song to open and close the album.
Right.
So he had that kind of juice, certainly, but he was doing that already in the early 40s. Wow. So that didn't come after the big stardom. He was a discriminating song selector, if that's a good way to put it. He really went for the most high quality songs from the very beginning, even when he was with Tommy Dorsey in the earliest part of his career.
Right.
All right. Thank you so much. This is amazing.
This has been an amazing.
I would love anybody who has questions or thoughts or suggestions to email us.
Absolutely.
You can email me at dana.polan@nyu.edu, because we really want to hear your thoughts.
So that's Dana, DANA.POLAN
@nyu.edu.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, this was great. Thanks.
Yes, and we do have a